So, our video today is about putting photosynthesis and cellular respiration in context. We're going to be talking about how matter and energy interact in ecosystems, and we're going to be talking about how cellular respiration and photosynthesis are part of those interactions. So the first thing that we need to kind of get down is the difference between producers and consumers. Producers, similar to the term autotrophs, are organisms that make their own energy. The producers that you're the most familiar with will be plants. Those are the producers we have spent the most time talking about. We've gone through photosynthesis. We've talked about what those producers do. Consumers are things that do not make their own energy. They do not go through something like chemosynthesis or photosynthesis. They eat other organisms in order to get their energy. So producers produce or make their own energy. Consumers consume or eat their energy. And this really comes into play when we start looking at trophic levels in ecosystems. So the base level trophic level will be producers, where those are going to be things that take sunlight and they produce sugars from that sunlight. And then you have all the different types of consumers. And consumers can really take multiple different pathways when they start trying to figure out where they're going to get their energy from. They can be herbivores, where they only eat plants. They can be carnivores, where they only eat other animals or insects, those kinds of living things. Or they can be omnivores, where they eat both producers or plants and other consumers. And so because there are multiple different pathways for consumers to take, these kinds of food chains can become very complicated as you have different interactions between different consumers and different producers. But the biggest takeaway when you start thinking about energy and how it's produced by producers and consumed by consumers is that we have a problem where the energy is lost over time. And as we move through different layers of the ecosystem, as we move through different trophic levels, only a small portion of the energy gets transferred to the next level. So here we have a producer at the base of this pyramid, and if they account for 100% of the energy available in the ecosystem, only 10% of that is going to move to the next level. And only 10% of that, which will be 1% of the total that was originally here, will move to the secondary consumer. And only 10% of that will move. And only 10% of that will move. So as we move up in trophic levels, as we move from producers to consumers to a higher level consumer and upwards, we lose energy. Not all the energy makes it to the next level. It's lost in the form of body heat. It's lost in just digestion. It's not converted to actual activity. And so this kind of has some big implications for the populations of these organisms. If you kind of look at how numerous these things are going to be, plants are going to be pretty numerous in any given location. And as you look at each of these next layers, the numbers of those individuals in a given area are going to decrease. So things like primary consumers, things like butterflies or other insects, those are also really numerous. We have thousands of insects in a given area. But as we move higher up, we're going to get fewer and fewer of those organisms because there's just not the energy available for them to have the same kind of numbers that we see lower in the pyramid. Okay, so how do photosynthesis and cellular respiration come into play in all of this? Well, photosynthesis and cellular respiration, remember, are opposite reactions. They're the mirrors or the reverse of each other. And so if you look at how we're cycling those elements between those reactions, you can start to see a pattern where plants, if we start with this plant right here, is producing oxygen, it's producing glucose, and we can have organisms like herbivores that consume those things that are produced by the plants. So things like the oxygen and the sugars produced by the plants are then used by our consumers in cellular respiration. And then those organisms that do a lot of cellular respiration, like our cow here, are going to give off carbon dioxide, and they're going to give off water that are used by the plants to do photosynthesis. And you can see that over here in this diagram as well. It's just showing you some more aspects of this cycle of the carbon and oxygen cycle here. So you can kind of see what those look like. But really what I want you to take away from this discussion on this slide is that photosynthesis and cellular respiration work in tandem to produce the reactants and products that each other need. Now, carbon and oxygen are not the only things that cycle through environments. And the next couple of slides, I'm going to take some time to talk about some other things that cycle through the environment. These are not things that I really expect you to know at this point in time. I just want to introduce them to you now, and we're going to come back to them later in the year as well. But I want you to kind of be familiar with this idea that matter, like elements, hydrogen and oxygen and carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus, these elements cycle through the environment and are used by living things as they're cycling through. They're never destroyed, they're just recycled. So you guys are probably very familiar with the water cycle, so we won't spend a lot of time here. You understand the idea of evaporation. Water, breaks those hydrogen bonds, becomes a gas, heads up into the atmosphere where it condenses and then precipitates down. And then I call this the collection stage, where the water kind of collects and pools into certain areas, things like in freshwater lakes and ponds and rivers and in the ocean and in the groundwater. I call that the collection stage, which then brings it to a place where it can evaporate and the cycle will continue. You also have things like nitrogen here that cycle through the environment. Nitrogen is very important for plants and animals. It's an essential nutrient for like being able to absorb water and things, and be able to do photosynthesis in plants. So a very important element here. And you can see how things kind of like decay and how that kind of brings nitrogen into the soil that's then used by plants, which then put it out as nitrogen in the atmosphere, and all sorts of ways for this to cycle. And then we also have the phosphorus cycle, where we have things like runoff, and we have phosphorus leaching from soil into water bodies, and it settles out, and we see it being collected up into large geologic structures. And then again, you have erosion. You also have phosphorus cycling through living things. And really what I want you to know is that we have cycles of phosphorus, we have cycles of water and nitrogen and carbon and oxygen, but I really want you to focus on the first half of these notes rather than these cycles here in the later half. And that'll be it for today's notes.